Hi, my name is Ron and thank you for clicking on this video about sourdough starter. Before we get into the part about feeding and caring for your starter, let me share with you a little background. About 3 years ago I started baking artisan bread. Initially I would use store-bought yeast, so I would mix flour and water, salt and yeast in a bowl, let it sit out on the counter overnight, and the following day I would bake it. But about 2 years ago I switched from using yeast to using a sourdough starter. And of course, initially I didn't have a starter, so what I did is I bought a starter through a mail order service. I also bought a starter from a local bread making company here in my hometown. And then thirdly, I started my own starter, mixing flour and water, going through the feeding and discard process. So I would have 3 containers of the 3 different types of starters that I had acquired, and I would bake with those over about a month or so, and comparing the loaves of bread from the different starters. And after about a month, I couldn't tell any difference in the bread from the various starters, so I simply combined it all together into one starter. And so for nearly 2 years now, that's what I've been using. Today I keep my starter, and it's one starter, but I keep it in different containers. I have 2 of them here that I keep out on my counter, and I actually have another one in the refrigerator. And the reason I have multiple containers of the same basic starter, and I would encourage you to do the same, is if something were to happen, if I were to drop one of these jars that were to break or the starter become contaminated through one means or another, then I would have a backup. And so I think that's important to have multiple starter containers available. So with that little introduction, let's get started with the video today. Be sure and click the subscribe button so you'll be notified of next week's video when I take you through the complete process, beginning to end, feeding the starter all the way to baking of the bread. But now let's just discuss the starter. You'll first need to decide when you want to feed your starter. You can feed it the night before and let it rise overnight and then make your dough first thing in the morning. Or you can feed your starter in the morning, let it rise during the day, and then make your dough that afternoon. It'll take about 6 to 10 hours for your starter to at least double in size, which is what you'll need to make your dough. This is determined by the temperature of your room as well as the strength of your starter. I've done both ways, and I kind of prefer making my starter or feeding my starter in the morning and then making my dough in the afternoon. Second decision we need to make is the feeding of our starter. This is my mother starter that sits out on my counter 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I make bread or bake bread every single day. And so I can simply add flour and water to this mother starter and then remove it when I make my dough. Or I could take some of the starter out of here into a clean new jar and then feed this amount of starter and use this to make my dough. I've used both methods and both work quite well. Today I'll demonstrate both methods. First, we need to determine how much starter we have to begin with, so let me weigh a clear jar and get that zeroed out. Oops, forgot. Yes. So this says we have 64 grams of starter. So let's just take half of that. So we need 32 grams. A little bit more. Yep, 32 grams. So there's 32 grams there and approximately 32 here. Yep. So now we're going to feed our starter with flour and water. Our recipe for our dough requires 200 grams of starter, so we need to put 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water in our container to come up with our 200 grams we're going to need to withdraw today. $100. And 100. And then we need 100 grams of water. Perfect. And let's mix it up. So I've combined the water with the flour I use to feed my starter. I'm scraping down the sides and kind of leveling it off so it'll be easy to measure its growth, its rise. Okay, and I measure that with a piece of masking tape, and then I'll need to put one on this one here as well. So we'll set these aside and come back and check them in about 6 or 7 hours. Before we leave the feeding, let me share with you what I use to feed my starter with. And this is a container of my feeding flour that I keep in my refrigerator constantly, and it consists of 1/3 all-purpose flour, 1/3 store-bought rye flour, and 1/3 of freshly ground wheat flour that I grind myself. So 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And then this is what I use to combine with water to feed my starter. Okay, I'll check back with you in about 6 or 7 hours. It's now been 6.5 hours since I fed the starters, and they both have risen, doubled in size, and lots of bubbles showing the activity. The next step is simply to add 200 grams from each jar into my flour and water dough, which has been auto-leasing for the last hour. Adding the starter and some salt, and then we'll eventually bake the dough tomorrow, but that's a video for another day. I will post at the end of this video the bread after I take it out of the oven tomorrow, and we'll compare the difference of the two starters. Here are two of our 4 loaves of bread that have been baked this morning. The one on the right was baked with the starter from a fresh jar, and the one on the left was baked from adding flour and water to the starter that's been sitting on my counter for several weeks. If you like this video, please click the subscribe button, click the little bell, hit the like button, and leave a comment, as well as sharing the video with your friends. Thank you very much, and make it a great day.